Donald Coulter is an American in Moscow. That would make him interesting in itself. But he's a terrific journalist, a great broadcaster, and one day, who knows, maybe my successor here on the mother of all talk shows. Donald, welcome back to the show. I wanted, if you will, how your take on how these endless pronunciamento from Munich that we just heard in a call, where people are setting down conditions in foreign countries. The foreign minister of Germany is laying out a set of conditions in which the president of Russia will be allowed to continue as president of Russia. A set of pronunciamento in London about the supply of long-range weapons which can land in Russia and kill Russians. Do people pay attention much there to this mindless babble, these dogs barking as the caravan moves on, or do they just brush it off their shoulder?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you again, George, for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure. About how Russians kind of consider this stuff, I mean, you could talk to two different parts of the population, essentially. I mean, obviously, we know the majority of the population here supports Russia's special military operation. They support the government's actions in Donbass and in Ukraine. So if you talk to them, I mean, they really just see it as sort of fear-mongering and, trying to strong-arm Russia. If you talk to the minority that the Western media is trying to make out to be the voice of the real Russian people, then obviously they're going to say that, Vladimir Putin has all this coming to him. But these people are a small minority of the population. I mean, they're like this sort of same activist demographic that you were talking about earlier in your program, like Extinction Rebellion and these activists that go after these issues, seemingly, some sort of looking like some sort of opposition, but really carrying out the agenda of the status quo in that country. But obviously in Russia, they're carrying out the status quo of the Western powers. They're in a small minority. We saw the protests that happened in Russia right after the Russian military operation began. They were significantly smaller than most protests we had seen in the past in Russia, remarkably smaller than the protests we saw against COVID restrictions in Russia back when that was the main issue of the day. So, this kind of stuff is just, Russians really see it in the media, and they don't really pay so much attention to it anymore, I would say. It's just kind of babbling from Western leaders at this point.
Yeah, it's a very good point you make, and indeed we've both made, perhaps we've stumbled onto it, the difference between form and content. The form of Extinction Rebellion and so on looks hyper-radical, looks very militant. It has a militant form, but its content serves the interests of the powers who may indeed have supported covertly or overtly many of these campaigning groups in the past and maybe even now. What can we look forward to, if that's the word, next weekend? In Washington today, there's a big rage against the war machine. In London on Saturday, ditto. The anniversary of the war, you call it a special military operation, I call it a war. The anniversary of the war will, according to Putin, be noteworthy, as it were, on both sides. In other words, that Russia has some moves up its sleeve. Of course, neither of us knows the Kremlin's mind, but give us some of the speculation about what those moves might be.
Well, I can definitely talk a lot about that because I also work at Russia Today, and I'm one of the presidential journalists there. So I'm really following very closely what Vladimir Putin is doing, what kind of meetings he's having. And recently there was actually a pretty short meeting, but informative meeting between Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko and obviously Russian President Vladimir Putin. They met here in Moscow. And one of the main things they focused on was the the fact that, well, the effects that all of these Western sanctions have had on relations between the two countries, specifically economic relations. And Lukashenko talked about how the exodus of Western companies after Western sanctions were put on Belarus actually helped the state there get better control over the national economy. And it actually helped it. It didn't actually hurt the economy very much. It just caused the government to use import substitution favoring Russia to replace all of these Western companies with Russian alternatives. And the main industry in which that was the case was probably the microchip industry. That's according to what Lukashenko said. But another thing that he said was very interesting. He said that now Minsk is looking to produce MiG-25 fighter jets for the Russian government. And he said that they had proven themselves on the battlefield in Ukraine and Donbass. And the reason why this is interesting is because I've been looking at a lot of the speculation in the Western media about an upcoming Russian spring offensive, because a lot of publications are talking about that. There are some also talking about a potential Ukrainian spring offensive, but there's been a lot of focus, especially in the Financial Times, which wrote an article citing a number of anonymous Western military officials talking about the potential for a Russian spring offensive. And they said that this potential offensive would heavily focus on air superiority because of the fact that Russia is really trying to break at this point the grueling artillery stalemate that has come to define the way the Ukraine conflict is right now, along with the trench warfare that's involved in it as well. So it could be that Lukashenko's promise that Belarus is going to be producing MiG-25s for Russia, that could be part of a spring offensive that we're going to see around the anniversary of Russia's special military operation. And I remember you said you call it a war, I call it a special military operation. Just to be clear, I also consider what's going on here a war, but I consider the special military operation to have begun in 2022. But of course, George, you know as well as I do, and I'll just say it again for our viewers. I mean, this war has been really going on since 2014, when the West and NATO and the EU and the United States backed neo-fascist coup d'etat of the democratically elected government in Ukraine. And that is really what, in my opinion, was the main beginning of this conflict, because it's after that Ukraine launched its so-called anti-terrorist operation, when Lugansk and Donetsk said, we don't want to be part of this neo-fascist junta, and we want to be independent. And they said it was their constitutional right. And Kiev reacted with invading them. So that's when the war really began, as I see it. And that's also
indeed,
how
and your documentary film 8 years before tells that story absolutely brilliantly. Everyone should watch it. As you mentioned Belarus, what about the speculation that Russia and Belarus will come together, as that Belarus will become part of the Russian Federation? Do you discount that? It seems you do, or you would have mentioned it.
Well, I think it's hard to imagine, because it's a big step. And also the fact that Lukashenko recently said that he would not get involved in that Belarus would not get involved in the Ukraine conflict unless Ukraine attacked it directly, leads me to believe that if Belarus and Russia were to, become one government, then of course Belarus would have to participate in the Ukraine conflict. So there is a lot of talk, though, and I also noticed this at the meeting between Putin and Lukashenko, and the kind of rhetoric Lukashenko has been talking about at press conferences as well, about the union state between Belarus and Russia, because a lot of people don't understand don't know that Russia and Belarus they're not obviously the same country, but they're much closer than even two separate countries with an alliance. I mean, if you're a Russian citizen, you can go to Belarus without going through the border, and vice versa. So they have something which in Russian is called союзное государство, a union state. So they're not the same country, but they enjoy a lot of benefits that basically different states of the European Union enjoy, that they can, move freely between borders and the like. So it is possible that they will take that relationship further. But based on what Lukashenko said about the Ukraine conflict. I think if that's going to happen, it might happen a bit down the road.
Now, you're a younger man and haven't lived through as many wars as I have, but I've got to tell you that I have never lived through a war in which so few people were calling for negotiation, calling for a ceasefire. In every war that I have lived through, that has been a kind of central demand, at least by oppositions, if not government, and by much of civil society. Not this time. None of the Western leaders are, at least publicly, talking about the need for a ceasefire, a political settlement, and so on. But China is. And this coming weekend, Xi Jinping, at least by the end of the month, is going to have something significant to say about the war and the need to negotiate an end to it. What do you think might be in what the Chinese leadership has to say?
Well, that's another interesting point that's connected actually to what we were talking about Belarus and Alexander Lukashenko, because at a press conference before this meeting, not so long before the meeting he had with Putin, he mentioned that Xi Jinping had invited him to Beijing in early March, and that is going to coincide with a meeting that Xi Jinping is going to have with Putin in Moscow that Russia's foreign ministry described as the single most important event in bilateral relations between Russia and China of 2023. So I think he's going to say some definitely important stuff there. There's got to be some sort of information that we don't know about being transferred, being discussed behind closed doors between these top leaders, because of course they're the leaders of strategic partners. Belarus, Russia, China, they're strategic partners. And so I think China is going to probably come out on, once again on Russia's side in all this. And because they may even say something about Taiwan, remember, because Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan and Beijing promised that there would be some sort of retaliation for that. And of course, there's been military exercises since then going on around Taiwan. So it's very possible there may be some sort of big announcement. Who knows? Who knows what could happen? Every time Putin says there's going to be a big announcement as well, a lot of Russians are thinking there's going to be an official declaration of war or something against Ukraine. But there hasn't been yet. Maybe there could be something like that about declaring a special military operation in Taiwan. We'll have to see.
Well, that would certainly put the balloon up. And I'm amazed and delighted that you're on the presidential beat now. Are there any other citizens of Western countries actually still working as reporters in Russia? Because, of course, there can be no Russian reporters working in Britain. They'd be arrested.
Well, they're working, I think, unofficially, but they're still here, definitely. I mean, there's I've seen a couple reports, I think, from some Western outlets. They're just working as subcontractors, I would think. But officially, the main Western media outlets aren't allowed here either. But again, I mean, the reason for that is because the Russians were banned from the West first. And this was a tit-for-tat response. So it's ridiculous when the Western media is constantly talking about how there's no free media in Russia. I'm constantly watching CNN reports to understand what they're saying in the Western media. And they're constantly inviting these people onto the show who are like being described as Russian experts who are from Russia, but in Russia, they're considered extremists. And they're being basically peddled as the only sort of independent voices coming out of Russia, when of course that's not the case. It's just the voices that they want to hear. And they don't understand that those voices are actually in the very small minority of people here in Russia. I mean, people...
I think they do understand it.
Yeah,
I think they know it. I was yesterday somewhere, let's call it on the cusp of East and West, and was able, in a way I couldn't in Britain, to flick between CNN and your station, Russia Today.
Mhm.
And it was basically a parallel universe. Whatever view one takes on these great events, on these wars, special operations, and so on, it cannot be healthy that we have an information blockade, much more powerful and strong than any iron curtain. We have a total blackout in Western countries on how things look from the other side of that wall. Quite apart from that laying severe doubts on the claim that we live in democracies, in free countries, it's not healthy to the populations need to have a balanced understanding of what's going on in the world, is it?
Absolutely. And, we're talking right now about the information blockade that was basically, you could say, put up last year after the special military operation and everything. But I've been to Donbass many times after the Euromaidan coup d'etat in 2015, in 2016, 2017, I was there. And that was when really the information blockade began, because the Western media didn't want to show you anything about that actually reflected the majority ideas of people who lived there, because they didn't want to be part of this Kiev regime anymore. Some Western media went in at the beginning, but they just consistently made hit pieces. They just went in, and I mean, even when I made this documentary 8 years before, we did a part about the Night Wolves, which is a biker group that's patriotic, and they helped defend the People's Republics during the 8 years that Ukraine was terrorizing them before Russia's military operation. And they said that the Western media came in, they tried to make friends with them. They said, oh, we just want to do like a nice documentary about you. And then they went to the West and said, these guys are like basically Nazis. They're crazy religious people who don't like gay people. And so that eventually led to the fact that the People's Republic stopped allowing these people in, because they were just making hit pieces about them. And that's aside from the fact that the mainstream media in the West, when all of the events of Euromaidan were going on, they didn't show the Russian perspective or the perspective of the People's Republics at all either. And you know what? That's actually the result of many decades of lobbying our political system. And this is part of, you mentioned my documentary before, 8 years before. I'm actually working on another one now called Bandera in New York. And it focuses on the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States. That actually, the main wave of Ukrainian diaspora came after the Soviets were successful in World War II, and they retook the Ukraine, and they got all the way to Berlin. And at that point, all of these Nazi collaborators from Ukraine, from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and then the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, Stepan Bandera, all these people, they ended up fleeing to the West, and Stepan Bandera even became an agent for the CIA and MI6 for British intelligence, and they fought an insurgency against the Soviet government that was trying to rebuild the country after the terrible things that the Nazis did to Ukraine. They fought an insurgency against these people until the 1950s, when the KGB was finally able to get to Stepan Bandera and assassinate him. And at that point, after Stepan Bandera was killed, a lot of these, even more of these Ukrainians went to the West, and with the help of the CIA, they actually formed political organizations that have been lobbying the American government to help these people we're helping right now in Ukraine for decades. And there's modern organizations like Razum or Right Sector USA. They have their own organization in the United States. They've been lobbying U.S. politicians to give these neo-Nazi organizations in Ukraine money and weapons for the longest time. So this is also not something that starts in 2014 per se. It's been happening for a while, but this is what this new documentary is going to be about, the fascist elements of the Ukrainian diaspora. And we're actually working with some of the people that developed the super popular movie Ukraine on Fire, which was about the events of Euromaidan and how the Western narrative of everything that happened is not exactly it doesn't exactly correspond with reality. So that's going to be a really cool documentary we're coming out with. I'm doing some interviews for this documentary in Donbass with people who lived through the special military operation and the events of Euromaidan. We even have someone that went undercover and did some interviews with some of these people from these Ukrainian fascist organizations and got interviews with them. So it's going to be cool. We don't know when it's going to come out yet, but probably this year.
Well, I look forward to watching it, and we'll have you back on, Donald, to talk about it when it comes out. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.